My name is Eleanor Reed. For 18 years, no one in my family called me that name again. Not until that day in court. I sat quietly in the back row of a cold courtroom flooded with cameras and lights. The defendant was my younger sister, the one who once told me I should disappear. And then, in the middle of reading the file, the judge suddenly looked up, squinted toward my direction and asked, "Is that Eleanor Reed, Governor of Oregon?" The entire courtroom froze. My sister was speechless. Me? I didn't need to say a word. My presence was the answer. Have you ever been cast out by your own family, only to one day stand before them in a role they never imagined you'd hold? If my story resonates with any part of you, leave a comment below, hit like and subscribe to this channel to walk alongside me. Because what I'm about to share next, you won't want to miss. I don't remember exactly what day of the week it was. I just remember it was cold enough that my breath turned to mist behind the thin layer of my mask. The lab windows were frosted over, and the yellow light inside cast a dull glow over shutdown equipment. I was the last one to leave the room, still holding the final check sheet for our end-of-term experiment. The next day I was called into the department office. On the desk sat a report detailing a failure in the central system. The entire experiment's data had been wiped. Sitting across from me, the professor looked over his thick glasses and spoke slowly, his tone like ice. "The only person present when the system failed was you, Eleanor." I froze. I didn't touch anything. I was just double-checking my results before I left. "The issue is," he paused, "another student said you had friction with the team. That you felt overlooked for not being chosen as team lead." I didn't have to ask who said it. Natalie, my sister. We went to the same college, different majors but the same social circles. Natalie always stood out. Bright face, clear voice, always punctual, hair never out of place. I was the opposite. Odd socks, purple ink notes, always 5 minutes late because I liked to sit on the library steps and watch the wind move through the old oak. That wasn't the first time Natalie denied me. But she chose to do it in front of a panel. I went home that day holding a formal warning. The sheet was printed in plain black and white, but to me it felt like an erasure order from the world I had worked so hard to build. My father was waiting in the living room. He sat upright in a chair, wearing his old military coat, holding the Bible my mother kept on the shelf. No greeting. No chance to explain. "Did you sabotage the experiment?" "I didn't do anything." He set the Bible down, pointed directly at me. "You think people would lie just to bring you down?" I swallowed hard. "Dad, it's a misunderstanding. They have no proof. They just know I was there." Natalie confirmed you had an attitude toward the team. You sabotaged yourself." His voice cut like a blade drawn from the sheath of fatherhood. My mother stood behind him, clutching the edge of her cardigan, eyes fixed on the wooden floor. I turned to her, hoping for something different. But she just shook her head. "Don't shame us any further." I stood there numb. Every word froze on my tongue. No one asked how I felt. No one asked what had actually happened. No one questioned why Natalie was always believed and I was always the one doubted first. That very night, my father threw my bank card into the fireplace. He said, "Cut the dependence. Time you learn to stand on your own." Before I could say anything, he motioned toward the stairs. "Pack." I had just one suitcase, not even full. A few clothes, some psychology textbooks I'd highlighted cover to cover, a pen my mother gave me when I got into college, and a light brown notebook where I used to write dreams about becoming a trauma counselor for kids. As I dragged the suitcase down the stairs, I saw Natalie standing at the base. Arms folded, leaning casually against the wall. Her face calm, as if what just happened didn't concern her at all. "You really should learn to stay in line," she said. "This quirky thing you do, it was always going to end badly." I looked into her eyes. No remorse. No pain. Just a cold calculation she'd rehearsed long before this. I didn't respond. Because I knew if I spoke I'd fall apart. Outside, snow had already covered the steps. I stepped through the door. My mother didn't come to see me off. My father closed the door behind me without a glance. The click of the lock rang out like a verdict. I pulled my suitcase across the snow-covered yard, my palms numb from the cold. No car. No plan. Nowhere to go. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. And maybe they never meant for me to return. I wandered through 3 bus stops and 2 train stations before I found a small, sheltered corner beneath a bridge near an old rail line. No one noticed a shivering girl in an ill-fitted coat, face puffy from the cold, eyes red. I sat on the damp concrete, suitcase tipped to the side, one wheel jammed with debris, crooked like my life at that point. I don't remember how many days I stayed there. Day and night blurred together through restless naps and the sound of wind scraping past the beams. I survived on dry instant noodles, softened slightly by cold water from a gas station restroom. Ate them like plastic. At night, I scribbled nonsense into my notebook, fragments of sentences just to keep my hands from freezing. I wrote, "No one calls my name. No one is looking. Do I still exist?" I once heard people say, a person can only handle so much loneliness before they start to vanish from the inside. I didn't believe it, until I looked in the mirror of a public restroom and saw a dark, sunken face that no longer felt like mine. One night I stood on the iron railing of the bridge. Below was a black river, cold as metal, silently sweeping everything away with no one to notice it was ever there. I don't remember how long I stood there. Wind whipped at my face, sharp like the night I got kicked out. I thought about Dad. About Mom. About Natalie. I thought about the name Eleanor Reed, a name that no longer had a place to live. I lifted one leg over the railing. "Do you have anything for a cold?" I froze. A woman's voice. Low and slightly husky. I turned. A woman stood behind me, holding a brown paper bag and a thick wool scarf. She didn't look scared. Didn't panic. Just looked at me like a human being. "I'm sorry," I stammered, one foot still hanging off the ledge. She stepped closer, unhurried. "If you don't come down, I'll have to call 911. But before that, I've got hot soup in this bag. Want some?" I stared at her. The smell of beef stew and celery drifted toward me. My stomach growled, painfully loud. I nodded. She said nothing more. Handed me the bag and told me to sit on the steps under the bridge. I obeyed like a child. We sat there in silence. I ate. She wrapped the scarf around my neck gently, the way my mother used to. "I'm Linda," she said after a while. "I work at Shelter Hope. Not far from here." I bowed my head. "I don't have papers. No address. Nothing." "Then you're like more than half the people I've helped," she said, her mouth lifting slightly. "Do you have a name?" I hesitated. "I used to be Eleanor." Linda nodded. "Then from now on I'll call you Ellie, okay?" I didn't respond. But tears started falling into the soup I hadn't even touched. That night Linda took me to the shelter. It was an old 2-story house tucked behind a small church, worn down but warm. On the walls hung Polaroids of people who had lived there before, each one a face, a story left untold. Linda didn't ask why I'd left home. She just handed me clean clothes, a towel, and a bunk bed at the end of the room. "You can stay here for a week," she said. "After that, we'll figure something else out." I laid down on the mattress. It wasn't soft. It didn't smell nice. But I wasn't lying on cold concrete. I slept like I hadn't slept in years. The next morning, Linda knocked gently on the door. "There's a part-time opening at the community library. It's 2 blocks from here. They don't ask for degrees, just that you show up on time and know how to shelve books. Want to give it a try?" I nodded immediately. Linda drove me in her old van. I wore the coat she lent me, hair tied neatly behind my head. The library director, Mrs. Wilson, was in her 60s, wore glasses on a gold chain, and spoke slowly and clearly. After a few simple questions, she nodded. "We need someone to dust shelves and log borrowed books. It's hourly pay, weekly checks." I was assigned a small desk near the archives. Each day I logged returns, typed card numbers, and wiped dust from old shelves. During the quiet hours, I would sneak a few pages from forgotten books: psychology, biographies, modern poetry. Some afternoons, the sunlight would spill through the windows and land on my hands as they touched paper, and in those moments I felt real. Alive. Still learning. I didn't have money to buy anything beyond a new ballpoint pen and a cheap notebook. But in that notebook I began writing again, not to recount the past but to build someone new from what was left. Someone who didn't need validation to exist. Someone named Ellie Moore. From that point on I became Ellie Moore. No longer Eleanor Reed, the name that clenched my chest whenever someone said it. Ellie felt lighter. Simpler. And most of all, no one knew who I used to be. Linda was the first to write that name on the scholarship application for St. Matthew's Church. She said, "You survived as Ellie." So live as Ellie. I went back to school. Not a big university, just a community program in social justice and mental health, funded by a citywide church alliance. I worked at the library during the day, and at night I sat in a small classroom with beige walls and a whiteboard worn at the corners. My instructor was Mr. Richard Meyer, a retired prosecutor who believed justice wasn't just written in law, but in the lives society forgot. I listened to each lecture like every word was a drop of water I needed to survive. I took notes obsessively, asked questions, and went home to research more. No one told me to be quiet anymore. No one said, "Don't embarrass the family." I wasn't learning to prove anything. I was learning to exist. At the end of the course, Mr. Meyer asked me to stay after class. He looked at me, deep eyes but sharp with clarity. "Have you ever thought about applying to an advanced policy program?" he asked. I gave a faint smile. I never even thought I'd be back in school. He nodded. "I have a friend at Portland School of Public Policy. They offer honors scholarships to students from difficult backgrounds, especially those with crisis counseling experience. If you're interested, I'd be glad to recommend you." Took me a few days. Then I submitted the application along with a personal essay recounting a night I will never forget. It was a Friday in mid-October, just as the air began to bite and shelters filled to capacity. I had been volunteering at Shelter Hope for nearly 8 months, working the night crisis line, documenting emergency cases. A girl called in, voice trembling. Her name was Harper, 12 years old, beaten by her stepmother and being forced to return home after running away for 3 days. Her voice didn't sound desperate, just like a scratch barely audible unless you truly listened. I asked, "Is someone there with you?" "There's a police officer." I told her to stay on the line. Then I called child services. They said no formal protection order was filed yet. Someone on the team suggested, "If you can show signs of long-term abuse, we can intervene immediately." I returned to Harper and asked if I could speak to the officer. I calmly explained the situation, citing the emergency clause based on prior emotional trauma, quoting a statute I had just studied the week before. My voice wasn't loud or shaky, just firm. The officer sighed. "I don't make the rules, but if you sign the child custody report as a shelter rep, we won't send her home tonight." I did it. I wasn't fully trained yet, but I signed my name. Harper stayed at the shelter that night, and 3 days later, with help from a children's advocacy lawyer, she was placed in temporary foster care. I never saw Harper again. But when I wrote that essay, I described that call. And the silence right after I asked her, "Are you afraid to go home?" And she whispered, "It's not fear. I just don't want to disappear again." A month later, I received a letter from Portland. The last line was handwritten, "We don't just admit students. We look for people who create impact. And you are one of them." I cried the entire evening. Linda brewed tea and sat beside me without a word. Only when I wiped my face did she speak gently. "I've always believed the reason someone deserves to stay in this world isn't how smart they are, but that they chose not to turn their back on others, even when everyone turned theirs on them." I left Shelter Hope 3 weeks later. Before I left, I pinned a small handwritten note to the community board in the dining room. "No one is invisible as long as someone sees them." And I had made my choice. I would see. Not just myself, but everyone who had never been properly named in a world too fast to notice pain. The Oregon State Policy Conference was held at an old administrative center, historic, with a high glass dome and stained glass windows casting colored light across the floor. I arrived early, still wearing my worn gray blazer, neatly pressed, hair tied back, speech folder in hand. No one in that room knew I once slept beneath a bridge in Ohio. They only knew me as Ellie Moore, an immigration policy advisor, the author of a proposal supporting individuals cut off from their families in the name of honor. I don't know why my voice didn't tremble that day. Maybe because I'd spoken to children who escaped abuse and still managed to look you in the eye. Or maybe because I'd had nothing left to lose for a very long time. When it was my turn, I stepped onto the wooden podium. The soft tapping of my shoes echoed in the solemn space. I looked out over rows of lawmakers flipping papers, reporters raising recorders. I didn't have a prepared speech. Just a story. "I want to talk about people who no longer appear in the family registry," I began. "Not because they died, but because they were erased." Every eye turned toward me. I kept going, voice steady, clear, no dramatics, no flourish. We speak of justice like it's a system. But for many, justice is something they've never been allowed to ask for, because they disappointed fragile family pride. Because they were labeled as shameful. Or simply because they didn't meet someone else's expectations. I told the story of a woman I once helped, locked in her room by her mother for 2 years after coming out as depressed. Of a 10-year-old boy who once called the center at 3 a.m. and asked, "If I make mom and dad sad, am I still their son?" I didn't say that I was one of them. I didn't have to. I ended with a line I had written long ago, right after my first night at the community library. Justice isn't just about keeping someone in the system. It's about acknowledging they were never meant to be removed. Because no one should have to prove they're worthy of the name they were born with. As I stepped down from the podium, the hall was so quiet I could hear my own footsteps. Then a single clap rang out. Then another. Then the entire room stood up. A reporter from the Oregon Tribune approached me, not to ask anything, just to extend a hand. "You just touched something most people don't dare to name." The video of the speech was shared on the conference platform. A week later, I received invitations for live interviews from 2 major news networks. 3 weeks later, the state legislator's office invited me to run as an independent candidate in the special election for the Central Portland district. Linda called me around noon. "Are you thinking of turning it down?" she asked. I laughed. "I think I've been hiding long enough." I filed the paperwork. No fancy photos. The campaign flyer carried only one line: "Let the work speak first." No family portraits. No glossy videos about my past. I spoke about immigration policy, local education reform, and support networks for survivors of family violence. The press dug everywhere. They searched old records trying to uncover who I really was. But I had erased everything before that point. I wasn't hiding, but I refused to let them define me by what I had survived. The election passed quietly. No fiery debates. Just community gatherings, late-night talks at high schools, and firm handshakes. I won by a narrow margin. No one expected an unknown like me to surpass seasoned candidates. But voters didn't cast their ballots because they knew my name. They voted because they heard themselves in the way I spoke. 4 years later, I ran for governor of Oregon. By then, my name had become familiar in policy circles for my proposals on public healthcare funding reform and family witness protection laws. I didn't use any personal imagery in the campaign. No childhood pictures. No stories of abandonment. When a reporter asked, "Why not share those things?" they could boost emotional appeal with voters. I replied simply, "I'm not running for pity. I'm standing here because I stood tall without it." I was elected with nearly 60% of the vote. Still, no one knew I had once been Eleanor Reed. I never changed the name on my birth certificate. I just chose not to let others use it as a weapon. And I made a promise to myself: no one would twist my story ever again. I was in a policy meeting when my communications aide stepped in, her face visibly tense. She placed a tablet on the table, screen already showing a live news segment. A headline ran across the bottom: "Federal Prosecutor Natalie Reed under investigation for alleged suppression of evidence in controversial deportation case." The room fell silent for a beat. I stared at the screen. It was a face I knew all too well. Natalie still looked polished, lips pressed tightly, dark hair pulled into a neat bun. But this time, behind that face wasn't media praise. It was scrutiny, questions. An investigative piece followed immediately. It told the story of a single mother from Guatemala who was deported in haste while her appeal was still pending. According to a whistleblower from the prosecutor's office, Natalie had intentionally failed to forward new evidence. A recording in which police officers threatened the woman if she didn't sign voluntary removal papers. Everyone turned to look at me. I gave no reaction. Just nodded slightly, signaling the meeting should continue, as if none of it had anything to do with me. But that night, sitting alone in my office, city lights dim behind the curtains, my official inbox received an email. No subject, no sender, just one line: "I'm sorry. I know who you are." I sat frozen for a long time after reading it. A short sentence, no period at the end, like the writer hadn't finished the thought. I didn't respond. I didn't delete it either. The next morning, I booked a flight to San Francisco, where Natalie lived and worked. I didn't notify anyone. I didn't request security. I wore a dark windbreaker, hair tied back, and carried nothing but a leather wallet and a set of papers meant to be a cover. The plane landed just before 7 p.m. I didn't call a cab. I walked to a small hotel near City Hall. No one recognized me. No one looked up at the woman in a gray knit beanie, pulling a small suitcase behind her. I got a room on the 3rd floor, overlooking a busy, glowing street. After setting down my bag, I turned on the TV by habit. The news was still swarming with Natalie's case. In one segment, a spokesperson from the prosecutor's office confirmed she'd been placed on temporary leave. My family was never mentioned. And me, I didn't exist. Close to midnight, I walked to the office building where Natalie worked. Not to see her. Just to stand there a while. To look up at the high windows and wonder if she'd ever sat there thinking about me. The next morning, I entered the federal courthouse using forged credentials as a federal law researcher. Thanks to the way I dressed and walked, with purpose, with posture, no one questioned me. I passed through a side entrance used by staff and family members. When I stepped inside, the hearing was about to begin. Natalie was already there. She wore a cream-colored suit, poised and proper as always, but her face was pale, her eyes hollowed. I sat in the back where the lights didn't quite reach. A few minutes later, the judge entered, a tall black woman with graying hair and a commanding presence. Her eyes scanned the room as usual. But when they landed on me, she paused. "Is that Eleanor Reed?" The courtroom froze. I didn't move. Didn't answer. Didn't nod. But every head turned toward me. Natalie whipped around, our eyes met for a second. There was no triumph in hers, not like 18 years ago. Only shock, then discomfort, then something I couldn't name. I hadn't come to speak. Not to interfere. Not for revenge. I came to be seen. So they would know I was still alive. When the hearing ended, I rose and left without looking back. But behind me, I heard cameras snapping, shutters clicking like heartbeats. A voice whispered, loud enough to reach me, "That's her. The governor of Oregon." The city might have forgotten me. But that room was forced to see me. No longer the daughter kicked out into winter. Not the invisible girl under the bridge. I walked out carrying nothing but my own footsteps. And that, to me, was enough. I walked slowly down the courthouse steps, my heels tapping against the cold granite. At the front entrance, a crowd of reporters waited for Natalie. I didn't head that way. I turned down a side hall, past the auxiliary rooms where witnesses and family members gathered. No one followed. No one knew I was there except those who had heard my name spoken aloud. At the end of the corridor, Natalie stood alone. No legal team. No security. She leaned against a chipped beige wall, clutching a file folder like it was armor. The fluorescent light above made her look even more drained. Her eyes hadn't left me since I entered the courtroom. I stopped about 6 feet from her. No words. No invitation to sit. No apology. Not even a look of regret. She was the one who broke the silence. "I didn't think you'd actually survive." I didn't respond right away. I just looked at her, for a long time. Like I was seeing her not through the lens of old wounds, but with the clear eyes of someone who had drowned once and learned how to swim. She kept her gaze on me, then spoke again, softer. "Back then, I thought you'd disappear. Everyone did. Even Dad." I stayed silent. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I was weighing what was still worth saying between two people who grew up in the same house, shared the same bedroom, the same childhood, yet were never granted the same recognition. "You've done more than all of us combined," she said, voice catching, but still carrying that calm defiance. "Even I don't understand how you did it." I tilted my head slightly. "It's not about how. It's about who you had to outlive." Natalie gave a weak laugh. "You're still sharp." I looked at her not as a traitor but as a person. But I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt hollow. The years I was cast out couldn't be mended with one unexpected reunion. I stepped closer, stopping just in front of her. I was half a head shorter than Natalie, but at that moment I didn't feel small. She was the one shrinking inside a prosecutor's suit that no longer fit the collapse unfolding around her. "Why did you send the email?" I asked, my voice soft but steady. Natalie lowered her head. I don't know. I didn't think you'd respond. I just wanted you to know I remembered." "What did you remember?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Silence stretched between us, filled only by the hum of the vents and someone's footsteps down the hall. Then she looked up, eyes meeting mine. I remember the last time we drew dream maps on the bedroom wall with colored chalk. You drew New York. I drew Paris. I told you not to take the blue chalk again because you always used it up. But you did anyway. And I didn't get mad. I shivered slightly. That memory was real. That room with its water-stained wall. The streaks of chalk still etched in my mind like they were never painted over. I used to think, I said slowly, that if that day you had just said one sentence in my defense, everything might have been different. I know. Natalie's voice cracked, no longer composed. I was scared. I was selfish. I was always terrified of Dad hating me. Of being compared to you. Even though you never tried to take anything from me. She gave a dry laugh, wiped a tear with the back of her hand. Now you've climbed so high I can't even see the summit. Me. I'm just someone waiting for the court to decide if I even get to keep my license. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't shake my head or deny it. It was the truth. And between us now there was no need for softening. Only honesty. Do you think I'm going to save you? I asked, not breaking eye contact. Natalie hesitated. No, she whispered. I don't deserve saving. But if you do, I know it won't be because I'm your sister. It'll be because you're someone I could never become. I turned away without another word. Behind me, Natalie didn't call after me. She just stood there, silent in the hallway, like a weathered door creaking open only to shut itself with the wind. I left the courthouse, early morning light blazing through the oak branches near the front steps. On the same steps I once walked as someone invisible, I no longer felt cold. I had stood face to face with someone who once erased me from the family map like an ink stain. And I hadn't disappeared. No forgiveness needed. No validation required. I only needed to keep going on my own terms. I opened my phone close to midnight, the screen's glow reflecting on the hotel ceiling. A single message appeared from a number I thought I'd erased from memory. Come home for dinner. You're still blood. 7 words. No punctuation. But they landed like a blade. I stared at the screen for a long time, unsure if I wanted to laugh or cry. My mother, the same woman who stood behind the window and said nothing the night I was cast out, now sent me this as if nearly 20 years could be patched up over a meal. I looked toward the window. The city lights still glowed. I had no reason to go. But I knew I would. Not because they deserved it, but because I needed to look straight into what I had carried for half a lifetime. I arrived at exactly 7 p.m. the next evening. The rental car stopped in front of the old suburban house. The roof had been replaced, the gate repainted, the front yard trimmed neatly. But the steps were still the same cracked red tiles I used to trip on as a child. No one came to greet me. The door was ajar, yellow light spilling from the dining room like a scene rehearsed too many times. My mother stepped out of the kitchen, hair pinned up, wearing the same blue apron she always wore on holidays. She looked at me, her eyes slightly trembling as if trying to figure out if the woman in front of her was still the daughter she once left in the snow. Have you eaten yet? She asked, her voice barely audible. I shook my head. Come in. Everyone's waiting. I walked in, every step pressing on a different layer of memory. The dining room was set formally, white tablecloth, candles at the center, old silverware polished until it gleamed. My seat was at the end of the table near the fireplace. The same old chair, now reupholstered. I recognized it instantly. It was the one I used to study in during winter nights after everyone had gone to bed. My father sat at the head, posture rigid like a soldier's. Natalie was across from him, silent, eyes downcast. Everyone had a glass of red wine in front of them. Mine was empty. Dinner began in silence. My mother talked about the backyard lavender blooming, the church getting a new pastor, the neighbor's dog barking at night. No one replied. I chewed food without tasting it. It all felt like a silent play being restaged after nearly 2 decades. When dessert came, my father set down his spoon and braced both hands on the table. His voice was deep and restrained. Could you write a letter of support for Natalie? Nothing major. Just a few lines vouching for her character for the court. For the family. I gently laid down my fork and knife. The clang on porcelain rang sharp in the tense room. I looked straight at him. If I were still the daughter thrown out into the snow that winter night, with no money, no coat, no goodbye, Would my seat still be here tonight? No one answered. No one dared lift their wineglass. Only the wall clock ticked, 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 like a witness reminding everyone the truth couldn't be undone. I looked around the table. My mother pressed her lips together, fingers tightening around her napkin. Natalie kept her gaze on a crack in the wood table. My father maintained his posture, but his shoulders trembled slightly, maybe from anger, maybe from age finally catching up with authority. "You're still blood," my mother repeated, this time almost pleading. I tilted my head. Blood isn't a tool. I didn't come here to sign anything. I came to see who truly calls me family, and who only calls when the ship is sinking. I stood. Not rushed. Not angry. Just done. The old chair creaked softly as I pushed it back. I walked to the door step by step, calm but resolute. Behind me, my father's voice called out, low and hoarse, "Who do you think you are?" I stopped at the threshold, turned and looked him in the eye, the man who once said I didn't deserve his name. "I'm the one you forgot. Which is why I no longer need to be remembered by you." I opened the door and stepped out. Light rain had started to fall. It was cold, but it didn't touch me anymore. I didn't need anyone's umbrella. I'd learned how to walk through the rain without getting wet again. I returned to Oregon on a misty morning. As the plane descended, pale sunlight broke through the thick clouds over Portland, casting a soft glow across damp rooftops and fading red trees. In the car heading back to the state office, I stared out the window without saying a word. The world outside looked the same. But I no longer was. The press room was put together in under 3 hours from the moment I made the decision. No flags, no elevated stage, no background music. I wanted to stand in front of the public with nothing but my own voice. No props. Behind me, there was only a whiteboard bearing the words Family Coercion Disclosure Act. A simple phrase that held the weight of my entire journey. When I walked in, the clicking of cameras rose in waves. The flashes sparkled like the judgmental stares I'd once endured as a name erased from the family registry. But this time I walked through them without flinching. I stood at the podium with no prepared script. In front of me were dozens of reporters, advocates, and those who had followed my path since the beginning. I took a deep breath and began. For years I've been asked the same questions. Why don't I talk about my family? Why haven't I responded to the rumors? Why have I stayed silent? I scanned the room, letting my gaze rest on each face. Today, I'm not here to tell my story. I'm here to put an end to a kind of story that has lasted far too long, one that no one dares to name. A kind of abuse that leaves no bruises, but leaves cracks in character, in careers, in the voices of those labeled traitors, simply for refusing to do the wrong thing. I lifted a slim folder and held it up. This is the Family Coercion Disclosure Act. It requires all civil servants, officials, and public employees to disclose any undue pressure from relatives for personal gain. Whether it's a gentle suggestion or a veiled threat, they have the right to report it, and the right to be protected. A murmur spread through the room. I continued, my voice steady. We live in a culture where family is treated as sacred ground. But no one should be exempt from accountability, not even those who share your blood. And no one should be punished for standing up to the same hands that once held them as a child. I lowered my voice. I was once cast out of my home in silence. I lost even my name. And I had to learn to write it again, not in blood but in law. The room fell still for a few seconds. Then a hand went up. It was the curly-haired reporter from the Oregon Chronicle, the one who wrote about me in my first year on the state legislative council. "Governor Moore, this is the first time a politician has openly addressed familial power dynamics. Do you think you're opening the door to a movement against tradition?" I didn't answer right away. I looked her in the eyes. If tradition is what keeps people silent when they're being used, then maybe it needs to be re-examined. I'm not against family. I'm against the way it's used to control, to avoid responsibility, to turn justice into a privilege. When the press conference ended, I didn't sign any documents. I exited quietly through the side door. The rain had stopped and soft light shimmered across the wet pavement. My phone vibrated constantly. Dozens of calls from television networks, legal organizations, even individual rights groups. A major talk show called me the one who ended the silence culture in powerful families. The Washington Sentinel ran a bold headline, "Governor Ellie Moore, when blood ties are no longer a shield." I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel triumphant. Just an uncanny calm, like I'd finally cleaned a room I'd been locked in for years. That night, I returned to my office and pulled an old file from my personal drawer. Inside the stack of papers was a letter, handwritten, never sent, with no name at the top. I had written it during my first year away from home, then tucked it away when I lacked the courage to mail it. I unfolded the letter and read each line, my hands trembling slightly. If one day you ask why I never came back, remember that night, when you watched me walk into the rain and didn't say a word. I wasn't angry. I was just hurt. Because for the miles I walked after that, no one asked if I was cold. Not one person. I folded the letter again, placed it back in the box, and locked the drawer. I didn't need to send it anymore. The things that needed to be said, I had said them. And no one could force me into silence just to preserve a false peace. 6 months after I introduced the bill, I was invited to speak at a small community center in South Portland. No live broadcast, no press rows, no bright studio lights. Just an old room with whitewashed walls, a ceiling fan humming overhead, and more than 40 people seated in folding chairs, mostly parents, retired teachers, and a few young volunteers from local nonprofits. I didn't bring handouts or slides. No aides followed. I wore a soft gray cardigan, my hair tied back, holding a cup of cold coffee. The event's host was Marion, a woman who had worked at the Department of Housing and Human Rights for nearly 20 years. She nodded at me and invited me into the center of the circle. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. "I'm not here to talk about politics," I began. "I'm here because some things deserve to be called by name, using voices we've been taught to give up." Everyone listened. No applause. No raised phones. Just eyes of people who had once kept silent for the sake of family, peace, reputation, or to avoid being labeled the one who disrupted harmony. I shared part of my story, not all, not in detail, just enough for anyone hurting to know they weren't alone. Then a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair and a small frame raised her hand. Her voice was soft but clear. "What if one day the people who hurt us truly change? Can we ever go back?" I looked up, meeting her gaze. The question wasn't mere curiosity. It was the quiet ache too many had buried for too long. I answered slowly. "I don't know if they ever truly change. But I believe everyone has the right to tell their story the way they need to. For me, that story's already been written. And I don't intend to rewrite it just to make it easier for someone else." A silence settled over the room like smoke. Then soft nods echoed gently across the space. I was about to end with a word of thanks when the back door opened. A tall, thin man in a neatly tucked white shirt stepped in. He walked slowly, slightly hunched, with more gray in his hair than I remembered. I knew him instantly. My heartbeat slowed. Martin Reed. My father. He didn't look at me right away. He nodded slightly to the host, then quietly made his way to the last row of seats. No one spoke. I didn't either. No one stopped him. Maybe because everyone sensed something was happening, something beyond right or wrong. After the discussion wrapped, Marion asked gently, "Would anyone else like to share?" He stood. The entire room turned. My eyes landed on his wrist, still wearing the old military watch I used to watch him adjust every Sunday morning. He walked to the mic without waiting to be called. "I'm the father of the woman who just spoke," he began, voice low and rough but steady. "And I once didn't understand my daughter." No one said a word. I didn't either. He turned toward me. His gaze didn't flinch. I used to think success was obedience, that it meant following the path I laid out. I used to think my daughter was weak because she took the long road, because she spoke things no one in the family wanted to hear. I didn't react. My face stayed calm. But something inside shifted, not because of what he said but because I knew he had never admitted this to anyone before. He took a breath. "But today I realize, maybe I don't need to understand. I just need to acknowledge that my daughter did something I never could." No one clapped. No one whistled. No one embraced him. But the room fell utterly still, as if it had just witnessed something sacred, something no one dared to touch. I didn't step forward. I didn't say, "Thank you." I didn't cry. I simply bowed my head just slightly, as if setting down an old suitcase I'd carried for too long. When the gathering ended, people quietly began to leave. He didn't approach me. I didn't approach him. We made no plans to meet again. No promises to rebuild. Just a look held long enough, without blame, without begging. A recognition that needed no signature. Maybe each of us carries a memory no one else knows about. A wound that's long been covered by silence. My story isn't meant to win sympathy or applause. I share it so that anyone who's ever been pushed away from the family table, anyone who's ever been told to stay quiet because of a last name understands this. You are not alone. And your voice is not something to be traded for peace. If you've ever been in my place, or maybe the opposite, I truly want to know what you think. Do you believe people can change? Would you forgive them if they came to you tomorrow, held out their hand and said they didn't know? Leave a comment below. Because maybe, just maybe, someone else reading it will feel a little less alone. And if this story made you pause, even for a moment, made you think about the kitchen you grew up in or someone whose name you still wish you had the courage to say, I hope you'll stay with me. Hit follow on this channel because I'll be sharing more stories. About family, about the cracks, and sometimes about the mending. Not to sugarcoat anything or to force forgiveness, but to remind us all, no matter where we come from, every one of us has the right to rewrite our story, in the voice we were once told to swallow.